What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Martian MMA podcast. I'm your host, The Martian, also known as John, back for another podcast. And I know you might be thinking, it's kind of early in the week for you to be posting a podcast for this week's upcoming UFC card. What's going on? Is this a year-end recap for 2024? Is this just an early episode for the first card of 2025? And it is neither. It is a special announcement podcast where I'll be announcing that I will be discontinuing the Martian MMA podcast for the time being. I will no longer be making a podcast before each and every UFC card talking about bets for every single UFC fight, which is something I have done since UFC 218, since December of 2017, 7 years straight. Approximately 295 UFC events in a row, spanning over 3,500 fights. I will be breaking the streak this upcoming week, not talking about this upcoming card. And it's something I've had in my mind for a while about wrapping up the podcast. And, I wanted to wrap it up before I got to the point where I was, not enjoying making the podcast at all. Some weeks, I feel like I'm kind of mandated to do it. Other weeks, I do enjoy talking about the cards. It really varies. But I'm going to, announce that I'm wrapping it up for the time being. I don't know if it'll be final. I think it will be, though. I don't know what the future holds for if I'm going to continue to make any sort of content. I'm going to get a little bit into that at the end of this. I'm only going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes here and just have some thoughts about just the podcast in general, MMA betting, and just some things I want to say. But one of the first things I want to say is a big thank you to everybody who has listened to the podcast over the years. I really appreciate each and every one of you, everyone who has shared the podcast, retweeted it, told your friends about it, commented, liked it, replied to me on Twitter, interacted with me, discussed fights with me, just a huge network of people that I'm really appreciative of. And, it's been a lot of fun over the years making the podcast. It's been, a very consistent thing in my life, and I'm looking forward to seeing, what my life will be like without it. But, I'm going to get into a few things about why I wrapped it up, but, I started this podcast as a freshman in college when I had all this free time on my hands, and I was a long-time MMA fan at the time, and I wanted to make a podcast. And the original idea of the podcast was actually to combine conspiracy theories with MMA. And the first episode I had was about how Frankie Edgar was paid to withdraw from his fight versus Max Holloway at UFC 218 because he went and toured, the kings of Bahrain after he withdrew from the fight. And the whole idea of the podcast kind of came from that and just talking about the UFC in general. And then I got into betting in the UFC. And, probably 2018, 2019 was probably giving out a bunch of horrible advice and just sounding like an idiot. And it took me a few years to start to understand betting and fights and, the intricacies behind betting a little bit more. You can know MMA all you want, but betting MMA is an entirely different thing. And then I had Ozzy on the podcast for a few years. Those were a real fun few years having him. You definitely saw a boost in the viewership because of that, because, he's a respected bettor himself. And, I appreciate Ozzy for coming on the podcast all those years. And eventually went to solo in the past, year and a half. A few things changed. I wasn't tracking bets on Bet MMA anymore, which was a big change. But honestly, for me, it was a positive change. I really enjoyed not tracking bets on Bet MMA this past year. I tracked for 5 years. I turned a profit 4 years in a row from 2020 to 2023. And, ran a 4% ROI, ran, 67 units profit, which I was, proud of. I think I proved that I was, a solid bettor. And I just didn't feel the need to continue to track bets. I felt that it was a little pointless, and I've just seen the Bet MMA website go way downhill over the years, and it's a shame because it really could be an effective tool. It could be an effective third-party tool to track widely available lines, to track realistic bets, but it's really not treated like that. It's treated like a game, a leaderboard system where you have these people that are tracking lines that aren't available. They're tracking bet amounts that aren't available to bet on books. They're tracking old lines. They're tracking exorbitant amounts of units. There are people out there that claim to be, legitimate bettors that are selling picks and telling you to bet their picks, and they're also betting 30 to 40 units every single UFC event, which is just blatant, fraudulent behavior. So I just realized that over the years that if I'm using Bet MMA as it's intended to be used, tracking widely available lines, realistic bet sizes, only tracking about 6 to 10 units per event on average, but I'm only getting, 200 to 300 views per podcast, and I look on Twitter and I see people that are selling picks and they're marketing themselves and they're pimping themselves out and they're promising these unrealistic expectations, and then they're tracking unrealistic bet amounts that you can't get down on certain books. They're tracking stale lines. They're tracking 30, 40, 50 units per event, yet they're raking in the views. And it just made me realize that if it takes, being a fraud and selling yourself out like this and lying to people to gain all these views, to gain the thousands of views in MMA podcasting, I don't really want to do that. So I stopped caring about that. I stopped using Bet MMA, and it was a change for the better, in my opinion. It's gotten less fun over the years, the whole tracking MMA bets, and back in even pre-pandemic and especially during the pandemic, it was really fun to do it, and there was a lot of personalities on Twitter. There was a lot of accounts popping up. You had your good, reliable bettors that had been around for years, and then every now and then there'd be a new guy who came around who, was trying to make a name for himself and, acted a fool, and it was fun to watch him crash and burn. That happened for a few years, and that's just kind of fizzled out, and I feel like there's less interaction on Twitter these days. There's not enough or as much, banter and guys posting and whatnot. So I think it's gotten a little less fun, creating content for that reason. And honestly, another reason why we're stopping the podcast is I think betting MMA has gotten tougher over the years as more and more people have bet, as it's become more regulated on domestic sports books. It's actually become a little bit tougher, and you have to kind of change your approach. The same strategy that profited 5 years ago isn't the same strategy that's going to profit now. And, I'm constantly looking to kind of adapt myself, and I've moved more towards live betting. And that's just something that I think doesn't make for good content, right? If I am analyzing a fight and I say, yeah, I think the favorite's going to win, but I'm going to live bet him. Or I think the underdog is value, but I'm going to wait until live bet him. That can be valuable information, but at a certain point, that's not what people want to hear. And I feel a little bad at times, going with that as my approach. If I'm talking about 12 fights on a card and my strategy is to live bet 6 of them, that doesn't really provide good content. I didn't really want to waste people's time giving out advice often like that. And yeah, MMA has just gotten a lot tougher to profit on, and the game has changed in a bit. I think that one of the main differences I've noticed is that betting money line has just become a lot more difficult, and I'm kind of forced to change to different, props and derivative markets, and, some of these bets are only available on a small amount of books. And that's another thing, is it's not really good content to be listening to someone giving out bets when they're, very concentrated to one book. So, if I'm using DraftKings a lot and someone is listening to me, in Europe or something, and they don't have access to that, what are they listening to me for if they can't really bet the lines I'm talking about? So that's another thing. And, I never wanted to act like I was the biggest and the greatest bettor ever. I wanted to break down the fights from like an analytical and skill perspective. I wanted to talk about the bets, but I also wanted to try to be, entertaining and add some levity to the situation. There were some podcasts lately where I did the entire podcast and I thought to myself, damn, that was just dead serious. Like I wasn't having any fun. I wasn't joking around. And because some of these UFC cards I just feel aren't that exciting. And that's kind of another reason why the interest for me has tailed off, is because, it's like looking at this week's UFC card, right? The one that I'm not going to be analyzing on Saturday, Dern versus Ribas 2. Bro, that card looks fucking terrible. Like, it just looks like the most uninteresting card of fights, and I just don't really want to talk about them. And, Mackenzie Dern in another main event and a rematch. Like, bro, some of these UFC fights, honestly, are just boring, and they're not really worth talking about. And I'm going to still bet them and still analyze them and still try to profit some way from them. But it's gotten to the point where I just don't feel that making content is fun for me. And I also kind of, my viewership has dropped, which hasn't really been a big thing on my mind. I really never cared about viewership too much. At the peak, we maybe got 500 to 600 listeners, when Ozzy was here. And then, lately it's been only more like 100 to 200. And, that's never, exciting to see, but it also really didn't bother me. But I got to the point where I'm like, man, who is tuning in to listen to me talk about these Apex UFC Fight Night cards? And honestly, I mean, there are some people out there that are still doing numbers, that are still doing, 2,000-3,000 on their podcast, and, good for them. But I'm just wondering who's really listening at this point. I think that the UFC product is a bit stale and boring at this point. And, thank God for betting. I'm still interested in it because I am betting. I'm still, making money betting on these fights. But I think that, making content and even consuming content around the UFC these days is dwindling. And as for what's next, I really don't know. I really don't know what I'm going to do. I would like to still make some sort of content. I don't know if it's going to be written content or, maybe some form of articles, or maybe doing something on Twitter, posting on Twitter. It's a shame because, one of the godfathers of MMA betting, Gugabe, does his threads on Twitter where he posts a thread of all of his thoughts. But honestly, I think those threads are so atrocious, and the analysis and the bets are just so awful consistently that unfortunately our boy Gugabe has kind of ruined that threads format for anybody else going forward. So I don't know if I want to do that. I think I'll envision myself doing, maybe just some brief thoughts on a Word document, screenshotting that, and then, uploading that to Twitter. And, I think I'll still be, tweeting pretty often, definitely tweeting live during the events. And, one thing I'll say also, I want to stay in touch with some people. If you listen to the podcast, please, drop a comment and let me know how I can, stay in touch. I really appreciated everybody who liked and watched the videos and commented. And I'm always down to discuss fights and just talk fights with anybody. So, please reply on Twitter, leave a comment on YouTube of where I can reach you, and, send me a DM on Twitter. I want to stay in touch with all of the loyal listeners and good people who have supported the podcast over the time. And I'm still going to be analyzing the fights and betting and discussing them. I'm just not going to be, making that weekly podcast content. And it's a grind at times, man. I mean, there are a lot of times where it was, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I hadn't even begun to start analyzing the fights and watching the tape, and I grinded out and finished the podcast on Thursday night. And, I had a lot more free time in past, phases of my life, and I'm gotten to the point now where there's just some other stuff I want to do. I want to, do other stuff with my free time, and I'm looking forward to that. So that is just about everything I have to say. The podcast will still be on SoundCloud for another month because it does cost money to host the content on SoundCloud. I think you only get 2 or 3 hours or something like that for free. So I will be stopping paying to host it on SoundCloud. So if you want to listen to the old episodes, you will have to go to YouTube. They'll always be on the Martian MMA YouTube channel. But this podcast, I think I'll probably just leave the 4 most recent episodes on SoundCloud, or 4 or 5 or however many I can listen to. And I think that about does it, So this is something that's been in my mind for a few months now. Thought about when was the right time to wrap it up. And as I said, I enjoyed betting in 2024 more than I did in the past few years without tracking bets on BetMMA. And I might enjoy betting even more this upcoming 2025 without doing the podcast as well. So I'm excited for what the future holds, and I'm very grateful for these 7 years of making all these podcasts. And I really hope you got some good information, won a lot of bets, enjoyed the fights more because of my analysis. And just once again, please stay in touch to anybody. Drop a comment, send me a message, reply to me on Twitter, and I would love to keep in touch with everyone who has listened. So that is going to do it. This will break the streak of 295 events in a row, which I believe is the longest streak of MMA content ever. I'm claiming that right now. Nobody else out there has made a podcast or content before every single UFC card for 7 years in a row, spanning 295 events. If anybody out there knows of someone who has achieved that, please let me know. But Not a single event missed in all those times. Very proud of that accomplishment, but that streak will be broken. It will end in the year 2024. And the last bet I gave out that won was in the co-main event, Cub Swanson money line, with one of the most fun and spectacular knockouts of the year. So was very proud that Cub Swanson, brought it home for us. And that is about all I have to say. I don't want to ramble any longer. Thank you all to have listened. Thank you all who have participated. I really appreciated this, and hope I can stay in touch with some people. And hope you all enjoy the UFC. Continue to bet on fights. And thank you for listening. This has been John the Martian. Peace out, everyone.